I welcome one and all to the day one of the 11th Creative Theory Colloquium. The panel Medicine and Technology aims to bring out the wide-ranging impacts of medical technology in the organization of social life. I would like to invite the panel coordinator, Professor Shinjini Mukherjee, to introduce the concept note of this panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited that we have such a large audience for our panel on medicine and technology. A big thank you to the organizers for getting us all together and putting together this incredible colloquium for the past one day and another day to follow tomorrow and today. I'll quickly introduce, briefly talk about the concept of the panel, and then I'll hand it over to our chair, Professor Harish Naraindas, to introduce the panelists, and then we'll start right away because unlike the other panels, I think we have 4 presenters, so we have to really keep to time in order to ensure we finish it within our 90-minute slot. So very quickly, to just summarize this, there are 2 kinds of sort of scholarly work, broadly speaking, on technology, which is one is coming out of the STS type of work, which has begun to look at technology and technical artifacts very critically and making them central to an analysis of health, medicine, society. While on the other hand, there are also conventional anthropological works that have dealt with the theme of technology and medicine. And if you go through the concept note, I've tried to put together some of the works that exist on this particular theme. The papers are very interestingly organized. I'm really looking forward to listening to everyone. So we're going to start with a paper about A2 genotypes in cows and the milk products that are sort of extracted from these cows, and which will sort of talk about how this sort of technology is having an impact on both biomedical as well as indigenous theories of nutrition. And from there we'll go on to sort of nutritional big data, big public health data, and look at the kind of sort of markers that public health data takes into account while looking at child malnutrition. And then we talk about the democratization of digital technologies and the kind of impact it may have on the proliferation of sort of disease categories, especially relating to the field of psychology. And finally, we'll come back. The paper that kind of brings us back to some of the theoretical framings on which this concept, on which this panel has been organized, is a paper on disability, or where we look at a rejection of technologies, which sort of tend to fix people and fit them within, make them fit better within an ableist society, and what that might mean for us in the future, and what that might mean for health technologies itself. So I don't know if I was able to summarize very accurately, but I'm hoping our panelists will do a much better job of trying to sort of piece together some of the things that I've mentioned, and I'll quickly hand over to Professor Naraindas.
Given the paucity of, you can hear me?
No.
Okay, sorry. So given the paucity of time, I'm just going to be very quick. So we have this concept note, and the organization of this panel has been entirely done by Shinjini, and she teaches in Flame University. And the 4 speakers are, we have Gurkirat Kaur, who's just finished a PhD from JNU in the Department of Sociology, now teaches in Shiv Nadar University, and we have Zakaria Siddiqui, who's an associate professor at Jamia Millia, and we have Jaya Mathur, who's a doctoral candidate at JNU, the Center for Social Medicine and Community Health, and we have Vinay Suhalka, who's a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Social Sciences in Pune at Flame University. So these are the 4 speakers, and the speakers are listed in that order. First we have Gurkirat, then we'll have Zakaria, Jaya Mathur, and Suhalka. Kindly, this is a panel with 4 speakers instead of 3, so I would urge all of you all to wind up in about 12 minutes each. Okay? Yeah, thank you very much. Gurkirat, it's all yours.
10 plus 2, right?
Excuse me. Each speaker will have around 10 to 12 minutes for the presentation, and after 10 minutes of your presentation, we'll ring a buzzer to ensure that we're on time.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
I can use this one.
Yeah, this one.
Thank you. A very good afternoon, everyone. So we're all here after the lunch, and I hope I don't bore you. I've got something really interesting, food-related, to discuss with all of you. And have you all heard about the A2 milk? I hope, yes. And there's a lot that's been going around it, especially in the Indian context of late. So if we can, Sanjana, can we have the next slide? Yeah. So if we just take a look at these 2 public advisories issued by the FSSAI, which is a body to ensure the food safety and consumer protection in India, the standards on food. So there are 2 advisories, which one of these was put out on the 21st of August, and it suggests very clearly that no business operators are can use the A1 or A2 marketing logo on any of their products, especially the ones that are milk fat, so something like ghee. Right, so the advisory was to not use the label A2 on any of these products due to the lack of scientific evidence. And just a week later, on the 26th of August, a clarification advisory was sent out where it was informed that the advisory has been taken off. So why am I talking about all of this here is because we're precisely here to discuss about this entire nexus, this whole network of how scientific evidence that gets created in the laboratory then intermingles with the state and the market and with the consumer, and then presents itself to us in ways that are pretty complex. So what I'll try to do here with all of you is try to unravel that complexity a little. And so this paper originally was part of my PhD thesis, and the idea of it came in because I was studying an arid zone in Rajasthan where agro-pastoral communities predominate. So one of these communities which is particularly marginalized is the Johiyas, and I don't think many of us have heard of them. They're a Muslim pastoral community, and most of them have migrated to Pakistan because it's a border zone. So they migrated to Pakistan during the partition, but many of those reside in the Sri Ganganagar, Bikaner districts of Rajasthan. And there's a long history of cattle rearing that they come from, and they rear this particular breed of cattle, which is known as the Rathi breed. So the Rathi breed is of late gaining a lot of traction on the account that it is A2. So a little introduction about A2 here. A2 is primarily a genotype on which cows are classified. So it's said, so this research began in New Zealand during the 1990s, where like the Department of Child Safety and Security, they were researching on looking ways to mitigate diabetes and lactose intolerance in people, and especially children. And what they found out was that this particular genotype in cows is responsible for production of this milk, which contains the A2 beta casein, which is like a form of protein primarily, because milk is protein. So they figured that most of the cows from Europe, which includes the HF, the Jersey cows, the Swiss cows, they, due to some genetic mutation like a few thousand years ago, they developed this A1 beta casein in their milk, and their genotype is A1, of course, and therefore that leads to all of this lactose intolerance in the body when we consume it. Whereas most of the indigenous breeds of cows, which have not been mixed bred with the A1 cows, have the A2 genotype, and the milk that they produce is also A2, which is apparently, scientifically it's evident, as they say, to promote cardiovascular health, reduce diabetes, inflammation in the body. So it has a lot of health benefits, as they say. But the news is that the scientific community in itself is pretty divided on it, because a lot of tests still need to be conducted globally. In New Zealand, in fact, in 2000, the year 2000, the scientists who were responsible for extracting this particular nutrient out of the milk and henceforth claiming it the healthiest form of milk available, they formed a corporation called the A2 Milk Corporation. And it today is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And that entire idea, especially post-COVID, has trickled down into India. So what's happening is that the Indian Council for Agricultural Research is now providing certificates, and the National Dairy Institute in India, which is located very close to us in Karnal, Haryana, they provide these certificates where they certify that a particular indigenous breed of cow is A2, and hence it produces the healthiest milk possible. So then this has led to the market identifying these particular cows and building dairy farms out of them. So it's sort of like a revalorization of indigenous cow breeds, which include the Rathi, of course. Then there are the Gir, Sahiwal. These are the breeds. And if you look, Sanjana, can we, can we, the next slide? Sorry. Yeah, just the next one. The next one. Yeah. So if you look at the labeling there, it says Gir cow Vedic Bilona ghee. And A2 Desi, it says. So that's where this was the concept that I found the most interesting, because my MPhil thesis was on nutraceuticals. And deriving from Professor Naraindas' work, I then ventured into the idea of discovering these knowledge asymmetries between these two different registers of knowledge. One of which is scientific, of course, biomedical, and the other one is indigenous. But what I figured was that also derives from a codified body of knowledge, which is the Ayurvedic texts. So coming back to the market, that's how these products are marketed. And I figured that in Bikaner, there are a lot of dairy farms that are springing up who produce these kind of things. And scientifically, the argument is that ghee cannot be A2 because 99.8% or something of the ghee is actually fat. So that in itself is a very flawed product that you see there, despite the lack of scientific evidence. So it's like more so a marketing gimmick that we see there. Now, why developments like these take place is what was something really interesting to me. Because the way these products are placed in the market, they suggest that they want to improve the nutrition of your food, the nutritional value of your food and your health. But the point is that they're never consulting the indigenous body of knowledge where they're deriving these benefits from. So the task was then to ask the Johiyas, the Rathi cow breeders, for their logic. So this is what I termed as the pastoral logic in my paper. So what is their logic of a nutritionally efficacious milk? Whether it is A2, whether can it be just reduced to this particular genotype or the form of protein, or is there more to it? And very interestingly, because I conducted a historical ethnography in this region, I found amazing narratives, which if a few of those is what I'm going to discuss with you briefly here, which suggested that, as Rose, in the works of Rose, he terms that this is a molecular gaze and it reduces the food itself to its component parts and not the whole. So it's taking the milk out of like an entire context, which actually maintains the nutritional efficacy of the milk. So I would like to talk a little about the Johias perhaps here and what is their idea of a healthy, nutritionally efficacious milk. So I'll narrate this particular instance to you. So the Jats predominate the agrarian landscape in this region, and a lot of them now are moving towards building dairy farms, leaving agriculture and building dairy farms with Rathi cows. So they move to the interiors of Bikaner, and I have 2 minutes? Okay. So I'll just quickly wind this up. So they move to the interiors of Bikaner and then they try to buy these cows from the native pastoralists there. And then they try to understand the milk on the basis of 3 parameters. One, whether the milk is A2, because they'll have a test for it. So they'll get the cows tested for that particular genotype. Second, what is the fat percentage of the milk, which is the SNF, right? And what is the yield of the milk? So this entire discourse is it's located in the productivity-centric discourse, which is not the pastoralist idea at all. So for the pastoralist, in order for the milk to be healthy, he has 3 parameters. One is mobility, the second is commensality, and the third is the herd size, the number of cows in that particular herd. So I have a lot actually more to say, but taking off from this, what I would just like to say is that the A2 milk in particular has taken off the nutritional value of the milk from its ecological context, and it has again placed it into this whole productivist treadmill, and therefore the purpose or the formulary logic of whether A2 or the indigenous ideas of efficacy, they both lose its characteristics. And this is probably not the best way to go forward with it. That's where I'd like to maybe end this. Yeah. Thank you. And I can take questions if there's still, because there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you.
Could you just briefly repeat again the pastoralist parameters?
So, I mean, I'm sure there could be more to it, but due to the commensality. So the cows basically need to socialize with each other. They need to live around, move around each other. They need mobility. That they need to be under the sun. So they cannot be in a dairy farm restricted and grazed. So they need to graze openly out in the sun. And the herd size is really important. Yeah. Thank you.
So I think the next is Mohammed Zakaria. We have the discussion at the end, right?
In the end.
Okay, so Mohammed Zakaria, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Can we get the slides on that? So I'm going to talk about certain recent changes that government is trying to do on the standards of measurement for child malnutrition. India has really, struggled in the area of improving child malnutrition. So right now, India's stunting rate, which means the shortness of height for a given age, is around 35%, and that reduced very, very slowly. Can we go to the next third slide? Yeah, keep it like that. Don't go into slideshow because it would be difficult. So if you can see that around 35% is the stunting rate, which has reduced very slowly, and around wasting, which is a shortness or shortfall of weight or body mass for the child given his height or her height. So underweight is a composite index of these two indicators. So I'm not going to talk about that. But these are the major surveys that happened in different years. So 2005, 6, NFHS round 4, and then round 3, 4, 5. So there is a correlation between no progress in wasting and very slow progress in stunting. I'm going to explore that in order to substantiate what government policies are trying to do. So in 2013, there was a paper in EPW by Professor Arvind Panagaria that since India is doing quite well in infant mortality. Go to slide 6. You can see that the dark black line is actually the average performance of the countries in the world for infant mortality given their GDP per capita. So the red dots that you see are basically Indian performance measurement, and you can see that India is doing really well as far as global standards are concerned. So Arvind Panagaria's argument was that given this kind of performance that India is having a very high prevalence of stunting is not logical, because stunting is a very important risk factor, and if risk factor is high, our mortality should be high, but that is not the case. And then he came up to this idea that India's measurement of stunting may be mismeasurement, because Indian children are or maybe genetically dispossessed for lower height. So this discussion happened largely disregarding other evidences that were already there, which is about wasting. So India has been topping the wasting list. That 19% that you saw is the highest rate of wasting in the world. And we have been there for 20 years. We have not moved a single inch from there. And this discussion can also ask us to argue that Indian children are genetically dispossessed for lower weight, right? If Indian children are not at all improving in their weight for 20 years, given the growth and everything that we had, then it is possible that we may argue that given the fact that we have been able to save our kids from dying, given that much of high risk, that means there might be a mismeasurement of weight also. Now, the thing is that there is a slight improvement in stunting. If you go to slide 7, you will see that there is a bit of closure in the gap that we have from the global standard. So in 2005, we were far away from the average global standard, and then we are coming closer, which means that there is a possibility of closing the gap. And this possibility begs us to investigate it further, that what might be the reason that we have been able to improve, but we have been able to improve slowly. Now, in this regard, if you compare, come to slide 11, the wasting rates of Indian states versus sub-Saharan African countries, you see that Indian states have innate disadvantage. The higher numbers mean higher percentage of children are wasted in respective states, and you can clearly see that Indian states have significant disadvantage over sub-Saharan African countries. Now, this means that somehow we are not able to, provide protection from transient. Wasting is a transient factor because children, when they are exposed to, transient factors like flooding or some sort of infection or drought because of the food shortage and all that, they reduce in their weight very quickly. But height doesn't respond to or they don't get stunted so quickly, but wasting is immediately reflected because of the exposure to any kind of transient. It may be any kind of lack of nutrition, either from the actual input of nutrition, intake of nutrition, or the environment is infectious. So the idea is that India has always some sort of, particularly in Eastern Indian context, you have always some sort of flood, some sort of drought, and children are getting exposed to that. Now, the medical literature on this issue says that if you have a longitudinal data of children's performance on weight, then you see that weight is obviously underestimated from NFHS data, because National Family Health Survey data actually measures the weight only once in a given year, and the child has very different probabilities of being wasted in different months of a year. So if you are measuring a child in, say, December or January, the likelihood of that child being wasted is much smaller, reduced than if the child was being measured in during monsoon. So go to the slide 14. So you can see there is a cyclicality in wasting patterns. So wasting is highest in the wet months, monsoon months, and then it kind of reduces till December, February, but it starts increasing from March. So if you are measuring the child in December, February, the likelihood of that child being wasted is smaller. But over the period of the entire year, he might be wasted. So you are underestimating the wasting every time. And medical literature, from different studies, we come to an understanding that it may be about 5 times. The underestimation may be about 5 times. And you don't see that kind of pattern in stunting, because stunting does not respond to, the height does not respond to such changes, transient changes immediately. But medical literature also confirms that if a child continuously is exposed to experience of wasting, which means one experience of wasting and then immediately another experience of wasting, and child does not have the time to recoup the weight, then child starts responding to the lower weight by reducing his or her height, so that the body comes in balance with that. So that is the reason I am thinking of hypothesizing that heights are not improving fast in India because of this factor, because we have not made any improvement in wasting. So if you go to slide 19, so stunting is a biological response to earlier episodes of wasting, and it is also kind of found from the literature that wasting in first wet season or initial wet season actually improves or increases the probability of your child being wasted in next wet season. So, which means that it is difficult for a child, once the child is wasted, it is difficult for him to actually get back on track. And regarding this, if suppose India is going ahead with this idea that India should have its indigenous measurement of stunting, because India has not been able to improve stunting, and the genetic disposition argument is actually correct. I'm about to finish. So in that case, we must establish that wasting that we are experiencing has nothing to do with stunting. But that is not the case. Almost every contextual literature suggests that India is actually having a problem. Now, the problem is that we are underestimating wasting in the first place, and for that we need a proper longitudinal data, high frequency longitudinal data, which captures the seasonality and all the kind of crisis that we have. We don't have any such measurement, and we are topping the list in the world. We must do something about measuring our child's weight very frequently. And regarding the history and all that, I leave it to Shinjini to have a discussion on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jaya.
Thank you. My slide. Jaya, you could probably start with the presentation. We'll just.
Oh, sure, okay. So the title of my presentation is Betwixt and Between Medical Expertise Exploring Network Lives of ADHD in India. In a conversation earlier this year with the clinical psychologist, I registered a casual remark. ADHD is a condition. Can I have the next slide? ADHD is a condition that I've mostly seen in privileged young people with a high social media exposure. The model triumvirate of an ADHD patient, young, affluent, and located high on the arbitrary index of digitality, occupied my attention for a very long time. This morally tinged remark comes at a moment of crisis when the national prevalence of ADHD among young adults in India ranges between 11.4 to 15%, which is relatively higher than the global prevalence of 8.27 and 8.9. Bracketing youth and digitality for the moment, I want you all to consider and recall, when was the last time you heard a disease being categorized as a disease of affluence? Obesity, coronary heart disease, stroke, cancer. This false likening between social affluence and NCTs and the false distinction between diseases of the rich and diseases of the poor has since been summatively refuted in epidemiological and social science research. At this point, I already knew several acquaintances falling roughly in the demographic of young adults between 25 to 35 years of age who had been formally diagnosed with ADHD. Although what really propelled me to chase this line of inquiry is the incredible barrage of Instagram reels, memes, and infographics that I began to encounter, ranging from how to identify ADHD symptoms, how to live with it, dramatized portrayals hinging on the heuristic of relatability, of subtle and big everyday challenges of living with ADHD. I soon realized that this was simply the tip of the iceberg. Can I have the next slide? The next slide. Scholarship arising from media studies and critical digital sociology has brought our attention towards the changing forms of attention itself in the modern world, beyond its description as a scarce resource and its commodified and alienated form under modern capitalism in the ambit of the rise of attentional economies, with the most recent iteration of this argument being made in the context of platform economies. Beginning with Jonathan Crary, who indicated a crisis of attention ensuing from the expansion and industrialization of visual and auditory culture, to Tiziana Terranova, who delineates the impact of internet usage on the cognitive architecture of the neuroplastic and mimetic social brain. Furthermore, anthropological perspectives have indicated the entanglement of both conscious action and political economy with attentional technologies and techniques, and the ways in which they mold human minds and bodies in intentional ways. Finally, more recently, Sarah Pink and Minna Ruckenstein have argued how the emergence of new media, including algorithms, hold the potential to transform collective sensate worlds of perception, attention, and affect. In the case of ADHD, attention, the lack or excess of it, is cast in the ontological category of a pathology. Nascent and speculative research, mostly written from the place of global north, has further made claims to the correlation of the increase in the spread of gamified attention management techniques with ADHD diagnoses. In the ambit of, next slide please. Thus, in the ambit of changing forms of attention and affect and the emergent forms of life and biosociality itself, it might be possible to hazard a unique confluence between ADHD and digitality. The intellectual challenge and empirical burden of this research is to thus tease out the ways in which ADHD renders itself so easily to digital proliferation and the ways in which the disease category is made and remade. What is it about ADHD and its online circulation that makes it highly amenable to self-diagnosis, and what is it about the nature of medical advice and community support that makes patients resort to online modes of care? In the sections that follow, I will try to tease out tentative answers to these questions via vignettes from an interview. A unique confluence between ADHD and digitality. The intellectual challenge and empirical burden of this research is to thus tease out the ways in which ADHD renders itself so easily to digital proliferation, and the ways in which the disease category is made and remade. What is it about ADHD and its online circulation that makes it highly amenable to self-diagnosis, and what is it about the nature of medical advice and community support that makes patients resort to online modes of care? In the sections that follow, I will try to tease out tentative answers to these questions via vignettes from an interview with a 26-year-old woman, S. Post finishing a BA in psychology, S is currently pursuing a master's in education from a large private university in Bangalore. At stake here is arguing, next slide please, an association between ADHD and digitality, but did it come around the turn of the century? No. Earliest accounts of its description are by a Scottish physician, Crichton, who remarked in incapacity of attending with a necessary degree of constancy to any one object among school-going children. The etiology, symptomatology, and attendant therapeutics of ADHD are fraught with contestations and controversy, with the most prominent being how it's underdiagnosed, and its manifestations unclear among women and marginal racial and cultural groups, because the object of most experimental studies is the white male. Others argue how instead of being a lack of attention, ADHD is characterized by an excess of attention, which is perhaps why the class of medicines called stimulants are not uniformly and widely efficacious. Conventionally understood as a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by childhood onset symptoms, clinical perspectives are now evolving to accommodate a symptomatic understanding of ADHD to make sense of its occurrence among young adults. The DSM-5 describes the symptomatology of ADHD as follows. You can see on the screen, rendering an understanding of ADHD as being distinctly manifest in educational and professional contexts, and not fully delineating how this condition affects other spheres of life. In these moments of, next slide please. In these moments of expert uncertainty and lack of consensus, the digital quickly finds avenues to seep through the cracks in sense-making. Iron hacking has argued how constituting a psychiatric or psychological diagnostic category is akin to framing a moving target, constantly mutating and shape-shifting. Symptoms of ADHD are often indistinguishable from depression, anxiety, and bipolar. It is in these cracks that digital infrastructures of care become modalities of self-knowledge. S thinks that she displayed several symptoms of ADHD from an early age. She consulted a total of 4 psychiatrists who understood her symptoms as vaguely falling between depression and bipolar. She realized that she might have ADHD and brought it up with the first 3 psychiatrists who did not take it seriously and continued to medicate her for bipolar. The 4th and the latest doctor took her self-realization on board and diagnosed her without psychometric testing and medicated her with ADHD in 2020 because he thought that the depression was an outcome of ADHD or was co-present. What I find most remarkable in S's narrative was the very last sentence where she says, "I don't know what would have happened if I did not tell my psychiatrist that I think I have ADHD." The 4th psychiatrist prescribed her medicines, namely Inspirol and Concerta, which were both unavailable across major pharmacies in Delhi and very expensive to boot, with a single bottle of 10 doses costing around 3,500 rupees. She was able to source them, but she stopped taking those medicines midway because they did not work on her. I have read on Reddit, begin quote, I have read on Reddit that with ADHD, it's like this. It works on some people and others it don't. On others, it doesn't. For some people, it's a life-changing experience. If you read these accounts, Jaya, you'll start crying because there are people out there who stop feeling what you have been feeling. I thought something like this would happen to me, but it did not. My head constantly felt like buzzing and exploding with thoughts. Nothing happened at all, and it was very sad. In India, you don't get Adderall or Vyvanse, which are supposed to be very potent and helpful. S also tried therapy, namely CBT, DBT, and narrative therapy, and things that did not help her either. The CBT and DBT therapists gave her neurotypical advice, when she simply asked them to fix her ADHD, and she thinks none of them had the expertise to deal with the neurodivergent brain. Begin quote, she told me to make lists or whatever. I still have a list on my phone, but I forget to look at it. Regardless of how hard I try to keep up with things and how many reminders, I have things written on my hands all the time. I have to write things everywhere all the time for me to remember them. S thinks that therapy simply does not help ADHD patients and they need an ADHD coach or effective medicines to be able to be functional. Next slide, please. I find Nora Kenworthy's conceptualization of digital therapeutic itineraries useful in making sense of how patients traverse myriad digital spaces as therapeutic landscapes, instead of focusing on, say, one platform or an app, to fully appreciate the risks, opportunities, and choices that patients face in seeking care mediated through digital realms. S thinks that the internet at large has been instrumental in making her both realize that she has ADHD and in helping her live with it. The information and advice she found on various websites could not be found anywhere else, including professional support. Ever since I began chasing this question, I've been constantly inundated with ADHD content across Instagram and YouTube. The predictive algorithms of social media sites may make my job easier, but at the same time, I wonder what kind of biases it sets me up for falling into. As these algorithms become more sensitive to individual choices, they run the risk of creating confirmation biases. Next slide, please. Recent research on the digital entanglements of ADHD coming out of US, Australia, and the UK has almost, you can see that on the right, has almost exclusively focused on the short video app of TikTok and the ways in which its digital affordances create an affective terrain by depicting relatable content about shared material circumstances and making ADHD exceptionally amenable to self-diagnosis. But these things do not seem to be of concern to S, and she thinks that ADHD content is far too specific and does not make itself readily visible. In fact, one of the most popular Reddit threads clearly says that no memes, pictures, or videos. The space is only for in-depth discussion. This moment might be understood in longer histories of patient support groups, self-medication, and self-diagnosis, but it distinguishes itself in the definitive ways in which it disrupts the lay and expert boundary, in how expert patients navigate or even sidestep the terrain of professional psychological care. It is also worth remarking that S, in her narrativization, constantly kept using expert medical vocabulary such as optimal arousal, executive dysfunction, hyperactivity, hyperfocus, instead of using phenomenological descriptions to explain her symptoms. Let me just skip. Other than online content fostering a sense of realization that she might have ADHD, it is also what helped her confirm it. The latest psychiatrist wished to administer a test on her to confirm her diagnosis, but she refused, partly because the test cost 8,000 rupees, and partly because she did not desire professional psychometric affirmation, because the ADHD diagnosis was the one thing that fit her like a glove. She took exhaustive online tests to administer after researching which ones are reliable. 2 years later, a friend of hers who also got diagnosed with ADHD forwarded S a copy of the psychometric test that was administered on him post a clinical diagnosis. S finally took a professional ADHD diagnostic test which showed severe ADHD. Okay. Let me just skip to the last part. Can I have the next slide? Next. Yeah. We are at a time when there is an incredible government and industry-led push for digitization of health data and institutional healthcare practices, including AI applications in healthcare and also the emergence of digital psychiatry. These digital health initiatives are deployed as promissory and speculative stand-ins for patient-centric care and for making healthcare efficient, accessible, and democratic. Other than appraising what works and what does not, it is also crucial to pay attention to how this moment is transforming notions of health well-being and old and emergent diseases themselves from an emic perspective. Although I think digital health is not the only frame through which this moment is best understood, it is my contention that it stands at the unique historical moment of the collusion of at least 5 yet distinct and yet interrelated larger social currents, namely the movement for global mental health, the neurodivergence movement, psychologization of everyday life, cultures of self-care and self-optimization, and the emergence of financialized models of psychological care in India. I can elaborate on all of them in the questions round, but thanks for now.
Good afternoon. I'm going to read my paper. My paper is titled as Disability and Prosthetic Use, Intestations of Technology by People with Disability. One of the prominent models within disability studies, the medical model centers an individual's body as a site of defect, and thus it is the impaired body that becomes a site of intervention through the use of medical technology, including disciplining the body and using various prosthetic devices in order to remove and minimize the defects thought to be located within the impaired body. In sharp contrast to this has been the social model of disability, which posits that it is not the individual body that needs to match up to the social norms, but society itself needs to alter its values, assumptions, and physical arrangements, which in many ways lead to disability, thereby making a distinction between impairment and disability. This paper builds upon primary qualitative fieldwork conducted with people with mobility impairments who have refused to be the object of medical technology. In their refusal to discipline their bodies, like deciding not to use prosthetic devices, which could seemingly normalize their impairments, and adopting practices like walking on hands, scooting, or even using limited technology, allows them to be mobile on their own terms. By engaging with narratives of disabled people's engagement with technology, the paper demonstrates that people contest technology and are not merely at its receiving end. Even when using technology, they use it on their own terms, challenging in the process the technological and medical gaze which would term their impairments as defects. The working class people with disability that the paper engages with could be considered as contrasting the image of a disabled person who is often thought of as an overcomer, often through the use of technology, and thus has made his or her disability not matter at all. For the people whose life foregrounds this paper, disability becomes central to how they define themselves, though they also resist attempts to make disability their master identity. Even though technology used by people with disability was not the primary focus of my doctoral research, I nevertheless, in listening to people's life stories and the way they told these, I learned that many of them had rejected medical technologies and thus had refused to become medicine's targets to be molded into those with docile bodies. I begin this paper by offering an ethnographic vignette of one of my respondent couples named Changed, with whom I had engaged during my doctoral fieldwork, situated at the intersection of disability and religion in Mumbai. Kavita, who is in her 40s, walked on her hands fitted in Hawaii slippers as childhood polio left her lower body paralyzed. While she was given crutches and calipers, she found them too cumbersome to use and continued to walking on hands instead. Her non-normative ambulation or movement not only made her impairment evident, but also remade the social space we were in by the way her body moved about. She married Balu, who himself had polio, which had mildly affected one of his legs, in her late 30s, much later than girls in her community usually got married. This delay, she told, was because of her disability. When she conceived after her marriage, she was suggested by the doctors to not carry this pregnancy forward, since there was a considerable chance that the baby could be born with a deformity, since Kavita was in a constant sitting posture which could affect the proper growth of the fetus. She, however, continued with her pregnancy, placing her faith in Parmeshwar, suggesting her leanings towards Christianity, and when she gave birth to a non-disabled baby, she named him to mean someone who would continue her and her husband's handicapped lineage, her term, telling the world that people like us could also be parents and bring up children. Her refusal of medical technology, which suspected that her impaired body could place a threat to her baby, showed not only her desire to be a mother, but it also challenged the idea that people with significant disabilities like her could not become parents. She owed up her impairment and resultant disability without the need for it to get fixed by technologies of medicine, and in a way used her motherhood as a disabled mother to make a statement to destigmatize her disability and people like them, hamare jaise log. Another of my respondents, who I call Lakshmanji, in his early 60s, a double amputee, a bow knee, who had met with an accident in his early 20s. Like Kavita, met with an accident which led to amputation of his legs above the knees. Like Kavita's non-normative ambulation, Lakshmanji's short stature immediately remade the social space in which we were interacting. Having told me details of his impairment, I learned that he did not use proper prosthetic or artificial legs that the hospital gave him, but just use leather straps to cover his stumps or the base of his thighs so as to support them, in effect walking on his thighs. When I asked him about why he did not use full leg prosthetics, which could perhaps give him a more normal appearance, he told doctors here always insist that I use full leg prosthetics, and I initially even tried using them, but I would often fall down while walking since there was no knee function in those prosthetics. Instead, I just use these leather straps to cover, which support the base of my thighs and help me move everywhere with ease. Moreover, I found using and wearing the prosthetic legs much more cumbersome process than using these straps. The discussion that followed revealed that for Lakshmanji, the ability of moving around was most important rather than how he moved or how his movement appeared to others. And as Nancy Schepe-Hughes and Margaret Locke observe in their oft-quoted paper The Mindful Body about the Midwestern American farmers for whom well-being was defined as the ability to get around and to be on one's feet. Even in Lakshmanji's case, movement was not merely about technical problems of locomotion in terms of how he moved, but the ability to move around carried symbolic weight as well. He contrasted it with another phrase, jagah pe baithna, symbolizing a state of being wedded to a place, indicating no movement at all, which could have been for him much worse than his current non-normative mode of moving around. I met him several times later at another place where we interacted. We see in both the cases that I just discussed that differences that disability generates does not get erased and is rather kept intact by people's own subjective lived experiences and agencies. The prosthetics and medical technologies in these cases do not discipline and normalize the body, so to say, by erasing difference. In the words of David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder, whose book Narrative Prosthesis has become a canonical text in the discipline of disability studies, where they observe what it really means to prostheticize a body. They observe, and I quote, "To prosthesize in this sense is to institute a notion of the body within a regime of tolerable deviance. If disability falls too far from an acceptable norm, a prosthetic intervention seeks to accomplish an erasure of difference altogether. Yet, failing that, as is always the case with prosthesis, the minimal goal is to return one to an acceptable degree of difference." Unquote. Therefore, the very act of prosthetizing the body can here be seen as an attempt at normalizing. However, with regard to the lived experiences of the respondents I just discussed, attempts to normalize their bodies by the medical regime are rejected, and thus, in the words of disability theorist Rosemary Garland Thompson, there is an attempt by people with disability to build a world where not only their disability is present and becomes an important arc shaping people's life courses, but active attempts at non-erasure of their disability also makes it a value trait, signified in my respondent Kavita's words when she remarked that her son will take her handicapped lineage forward. Further, as Snyder and Mitchell observe, prosthetic devices, mainstreaming and overcompensation techniques all provide means for people with disabilities to fit in or to de-emphasize their differences. In a literal sense, a prosthesis seeks to accomplish an illusion. A body deemed lacking, unfunctional, or inappropriately functional needs compensation, and prosthesis helps effect this end. Yet, the prosthesizing of a body carries with it ideological assumptions about what is normal. But why must a disabled body be prostheticized? This is not to say that prosthetics are bad per se, or that there are no useful ways in which prosthetics do not enable those with disabilities. But the problematic here is that in prostheticizing a body, one is also trying to normalize it or bring it into the fold of normal. As disability theorist Leonard Davis argues, a normal body is a theoretical premise from which all bodies must, by definition, fall short. This false model of an ideal body also fails to consider the contingencies of the body's functioning within specific social and historical context. It is, in other words, a body divorced of time and space, a thoroughly artificial affair, as they call it. To return to the cases I discussed in the beginning, the medicine's emphasis to give prosthesis to a double amputee man is also to fail to consider an impaired body's contingencies, including a need to move around without the fear of falling. A few of the other respondents that I came across during the course of my doctoral research also shared their experiences with the medical technologies, specifically technologies that aim to enable them to overcome their disability and make their disability overcomable, as if disability can indeed be overcome completely. Some who had learned to move in various non-normative ways of ambulation, like moving on hands, moving in a sitting position, or scooting, found it difficult when they were given the free prosthetic devices by government hospitals or charitable institutions. Some told about the efficiency of movements in their non-normative modes, thereby emphasizing how ill-fitting were the prosthetic devices, which were both difficult to wear on the body as well as made movement or walking a more difficult affair for them. Thus, many of them stopped using these and moved around in different ways without worrying about the visibility of their disability and how the evidentness of their impairments drew them into the visual spectacle by people around. They hardly seemed constrained by the non-disabled gaze upon them than being concerned about the ability to move around swiftly. This reinstituting of a discomforting presence for the onlookers of their non-normative modes of ambulation without prosthetics is in many ways an attempt by people with disability to make the reality of their disability an integral part of the stories they tell about themselves, where disability has an active presence, not something that needs an overcoming. It is difficult here to not think of Foucault's idea of docile bodies, where he remarks that a body is docile that may be subjected, used, transformed and improved, thereby make the body belong to what gets constituted as normal. The goal of a docile, disciplined body is an economy of control, where each individual must internalize this goal of control and discipline by comparing bodies, behaviors, and functions to one another and to minimum thresholds, and by shaping and establishing acceptable and unacceptable forms of difference in order to achieve the transformations and improvements of docility. A disabled body, by definition, would be medically and also socially not a functional normal body. Foucault explains that degrees of normality indicate membership of a homogeneous social body, but also play a part in classification, hierarchization, and the distribution of rank. If body is marked outside a homogeneous social body, it is subject to hierarchization, to low rank, and to less power. I'm just going to take half a minute. In my fieldwork with the working class people with disability, I observed that even though they were subjected to the medicine's technological gaze aimed at disciplining their bodies, they were really less constricted by the medicine's focus on ultimately disciplining them and bringing them into the fold of normal. As I discussed, many of my respondents did engage with medical technology's expertise to fix their impairments, but they also realized that in the light of their relative lack of resources, stable livelihoods, they did not want to subject themselves routinely to the authority of medicine and the medical gaze that inherently assigned low rank to their bodies. There were not only practical problems with the cumbersome prosthetic devices, which were more difficult to use than how they really enabled the body, keeping the legs in calipers for a long day, using crutches in both the hands, wearing prosthetics in summer heat while caring for their bodies. People found themselves more freer and less constricting when they functioned without these technologies, while they hardly worried about how the non-disabled gaze subjected them to a lower rank because of their non-normative way of moving around. In doing so, they also became subjects of their own embodied experiences rather than becoming objects of medicine's disciplinary regime. At the same time, they also believed that their disability also served a purpose in a city where their lives were enabled yet became precarious because of disabled, unfriendly infrastructure, lack of stable employment, and income-earning abilities. They believed that evoking their disability did serve a purpose for them in terms of the ability to form disabled collectivities, biosocial modes of kinship with other people like them, claiming welfare activities by both the state as well as charitable organization. Disability for them did serve a purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the four speakers. I mean, all of you all have kept your time. I think we started roughly at about 2:20, right? So I think we've done splendidly. I think if you just work backwards from Suhalka's paper, right? Suhalka, yeah. And so there we have disabled bodies, which require prosthetic devices. And then we have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Panigrahi. You mentioned Panigrahi, right? The Economist.
The Economist.
He's the one who occupies the
Now
Jagdish.
he's in Finance Commission.
Yeah, but he was in Colombia for a long time.
He's there.
So he wrote, if I'm not mistaken, about a quarter century ago, he wrote a little article about himself in the Economic Times. I think he's only 4 feet 7 inches tall. Am I right? Would you know this?
No, I don't.
Yeah, I think so. He wrote a piece where he says, and he occupied the Jagdish Bhagwati chair at the University of Columbia for a quarter century. And evidently, so by these global standards, he also is a stunted person. If I remember right, please don't hold me to ransom on this. And so if that means, but evidently he's done enormously well for himself. and particular kind of, so which means, so you can see how this works. So there you have disabled persons needing prosthetic devices. Here you have stunted people requiring nutrition. And then we have people who evidently suffer from deficits vis-a-vis attention, requiring to be cured. And then we have people who are suffering from lactose deficiency, who require a new kind of ghee and milk. Right, and that's your work. And so if you use Suhalka's paper as a point of departure, and so you can see that all these are forms of prosthetics. You don't need prosthetics only in terms of having a leg or a hearing aid. I use a hearing aid. I'm also disabled, right? And those are one kind of prosthetic devices. But the other kind of prosthetics is that you need to measure up to supposedly a particular kind of norm. But evidently, Panigrahi himself doesn't measure up to that norm, but he's done very well for himself. Mm-hmm. And it's also possible that the particular kind of data that we look at, where wasting and stunting has remained stagnant, these probably are what are called data which is not disaggregated for social class.
No, we can do it.
Yeah, supposing if you go to the university where she is, you might find quite the opposite. I think all her students are very tall, and they're all very well fed, and they look, they're very good skin tone. You can ask her if you don't believe me, right? And but then the argument is one of my, I have a friend of mine who works on agriculture. So I bumped into her the other day in JNU. Other day means about 10 years ago, and she told me he has a very tall son. And she told me he's a fertilizer baby. So I think what we also need to look at is, if you look at global statistics on height before the Second World War, I mean, height, European height, even the Anglo-Saxon world, including in the Nordic countries, is only about 5 feet 6 inches. And the fact that we have tall people in the Anglo-European world is supposedly a post-war phenomena. And that post-war phenomena must be entirely motivated by, as my friend said, by fertilizers and the Green Revolution. So it's eminently possible that what we are witnessing in the global north in terms of global height is a pathology. And you take that pathology and you use that as a yardstick to judge global height populations today. So it might be interesting for you to invert the entire thing, look at statistics over the last 100 years, and if you do that, you might get a very different reading on stunting. But nevertheless, I mean, these are just, I'm hypothesizing, so to speak. Yes, right? And these are all interesting, but nevertheless, the fact remains that we need, all these are forms of prosthetics. And all these forms of prosthetics are to be judged, as she pointed out, in terms of norms that come from science and technology, and these norms that come from science and technology are often ontologically and epistemically rigged. So if you shoot a film with Kodak film, I'll show up much darker than I am, and Sinjini might not appear at all. Sorry about that. Right? She might appear as a dark blob. Because the Kodak film, the way it has been manufactured, is primarily manufactured to accommodate a particular kind of skin tone. And we use that same particular film to shoot people in the global south. They appear darker than they are. And this also leads to all kinds of problems. And this showed up during COVID. And people had skin rashes. And if you go to a dermatologist, and if you're a black person, you go to a dermatologist, very often white physicians in their textbooks who are taught with white bodies are unable to even diagnose black bodies. Right. So these are just examples I'm giving, and then we can see these are all various instances of this particular kinds of examples, where, as she's pointing out, is A2 ghee at all can be called A2 because it's 98% fat, and it's not milk, and which means the nomenclature that is A2 ghee is itself wholly suspect, but nevertheless it's being marketed. And then we have, I think, Jaya's paper, which deals with what are called modes of self-diagnosis. And it's very interesting. I think if I understood Jaya correctly, I think she began by saying that ADHD would be a classic example of iatrogenesis. Namely, it's
Do we have any questions for the speakers?
Yeah, please.
My question is my question is for Jaya. So you talked about how ADHD is disorder of affluent people. But I was wondering, as if even in my experience of I'm no close to the clinical psychiatry, but I am a kind of a psychology sciences researcher. So I wanted to confirm that if when we go to working class community, their style of reporting their problems and their references of reporting their problems, it changes drastically, as if they are living in a totally different world. And so when we are saying that it's a disorder of affluent class, how far we have gone into, making a new kind of language through which we can actually analyze people from that category.
That was a great panel and lots to think about. I just have a few observations because in the last panel we couldn't discuss about it, but I think it ties up well with today morning's panel, which was on philosophy of technology, and what Jaya presented, because it just happened 2 days back that I couldn't find my bicycle for 3 days on campus, so I was about to go to the security office to lodge a complaint that it's been stolen, and by chance I took a different route and I remembered that I had just parked it somewhere else. And the next day I went to meet my supervisor at his house, and I had told him about this, and he conveniently, when he came later, and he hid my bicycle. And when I went out, I was like, perhaps I again forgot my bicycle, and I was about to leave. So this is so relevant of what you're saying, and it ties up with the morning's presentation, where we are flooded with this. We live in the informational scape now, and as Byung-Chul Han says that the cosmology of information is one of pure contingency. So when there has been a reaction against axis of existence of being as being too static, and we have sort of fetishized the process and becoming component of it, but we find ourselves that there is no stability anymore. And it is in this context that yesterday, when I was saying that our great refusal today is to say no to a mobile phone notification, perhaps. And because Professor Mohanty very aptly said that there is a sort of an atrophy in the civilizational strength, because what else can you do? So today's, perhaps Nietzsche's Übermensch would be able to read 5 lines of a text without opening 50 tabs on his internet browser. So, and why this is important also is that we see on a macro scale, the human will to power has surpassed all planetary limits. But at a micro level, human will has been completely hollowed out. That there is no resistance possible anymore. And I would like to hear Gurkirat speak some more about the indigenous sort of classification of nutrition. Thank you.
So I urge all of you all to please pose short questions to individual speakers, and we don't have time for disquisitions. Please try and keep it short.
So I have 2 questions. So first question to Dr. Gurkirat. So that I want her to elaborate on the factorial logic which she mentioned in her talk. And second is like an observation and to Vinay basically. So when he has talked about the walking, not of the locomotion, but walking as something to ability to move around. So I just reminded of Gadamer's work on Enigma of Health. So where he asked what is actually health. So his argument is that health cannot be fixed by some standard parameter, but health is an equilibrium. So it is felt as an equilibrium. So ability of the person to cope up with the environment and cope up with the situation. So that I find a very interesting parallel in your talk. Thank you.
Just a brief question again to Vinay. I appreciate the.
You're speaking to the microphone.
I appreciate the discussion that you presented extremely, and only it appears then that society is disabled, and there are no disability studies because society is unable to understand difference and different people, and I find that it is more prominent than for instance in my childhood when we confronted disability amongst the classmates, and what I see today that even so I want to know, because when I urged some counselors in school to invite parents of so-called normal children to be present and other children to be present when we were discussing the problems of the disabled in school. There was no positive response to that. So I'd like to know whether any developments have taken place.
Go ahead. Yes. Go ahead, Santosh.
Hi, I'm Santosh. So thank you so much, Gurkirat, for a wonderful presentation. So I just wanted to know, like, you have two accounts. One is scientific and other is the indigenous people. So could you elaborate more on, like, what sort of methods you have used?
Yes, thank you. Gurkirat, in this very fascinating portrayal from New Zealand and also Rajasthan, now if there are some experiential dimensions, especially from women, and even this idea of healthy diet, and it relates to different kind of cosmology, the space opening, and the feminine, experience. Secondly, about attention, and in a very this complex world, as a kind of a digital, closure, but at the same time, what kind of ecologies are emerging? Because we know that there's a very interesting field of social therapy, and it is not just the counselor and the patient. So similarly, if there are certain ecological ways of handling attention, and third thing about nutrition, along with just measuring nutrition, but also policy initiatives like MS Swaminathan, his work on biofertilizer, biofortification, and the nutrition garden, and in a way, how do we tackle the challenge of nutrition in a much more multidimensional, grounded way by acknowledging the realities of classification.
My question to Gurkirat Kaur, that when you classify that this industry has become multi-million-dollar industry, and it's misunderstanding of science basically, that they have understood that A2 milk is something very healthy. I'm saying that whatever they have committed, the error they have committed, that this is not science. I'm saying that the science is not in the one fact or one research, but in the consensus of it all, right? There has to be a scientific consensus of what constitutes a healthier milk. And since the healthier word itself is very ambiguous, the conversation has to be stressed for a very long time, and it will be, the consensus will be much more difficult to arise. So in that sense, to make a value judgment that A2 category itself is not valid, or it's valid, or it's healthier, that the error they have made. And similarly, on the other side, we have made an error that A2 is not healthy, or it can't be a basis for healthier milk. Don't you think that we have committed the same error in that sense?
I think all of you can answer.
Let everyone respond and maybe close.
Okay, so who would like to speak? Who would like to start?
You have great stuff here.
About the first question about diseases of affluence, that is not the point that I made. I was mentioning a remark that was made to me, and I actually think it's quite the opposite. And I mentioned in my presentation that these false binaries of diseases of the rich and the diseases of the poor, as we know, has been the case with NCDs. 20 years ago, we used to think only rich people get diabetes because it's a problem of overconsumption. So since then, it has been summatively disproved. And that is actually where I stand. That
This came with COVID also.
sorry? Yes. So we now know that for all kinds of diseases, this really isn't the case. And there was a study which showed that among fishermen in Kerala, there was a 28% prevalence of hyperkinetic disorder, which is a cognate of ADHD, which is alcohol-induced. So I don't think, this is not my stance, that, and I also think that, yes, I also mentioned in my presentation that this research has exclusively been conducted on white males. So we don't know the ways in which it manifests among other cultural groups and even among women. The second point about, I think there was something about affect and attention and whether we need to, about human will. I am of the opinion that our affect is, the ways in which our modalities of perception and affect are changing, and they always have. I tried to list out some of the literature which has spoken about it, right from the latest iteration of it being algorithms, but with other audiovisual technologies, our ways of perception has changed. So we need not actually take on board that the ways in which our attentional capacities are changing might necessarily be a pathology. And when it comes to resisting our mobile phones, I'm not very optimistic how much we can actually do it. So, and that is a part of what the neurodivergence movement also tries to argue for, that possibly our brains have started working differently. So we need to change the parameters with which we define what is normal. The other question about ecological ways of handling attention, if I understood you correctly, and what you mean by social therapy, yes, there are, so social media, especially WhatsApp groups, they become avenues for these patients, the patient groups that I work with, they become avenues for these patient groups to communitize, to collect, and to share ways of managing their conditions with each other, because their conditions are not taken seriously. Because at this point everybody thinks that they have ADHD because it's on a sliding scale of severity. At one moment you can actually be, yes, forgetting things is simply not a symptom of ADHD. We all tend to forget things all the time. But so it's not taken seriously by A, people, and B, also the medical establishment. So these patient support groups act as spaces where individuals who are diagnosed can share resources, share ways of how they deal with their conditions. Yeah.
Thank you for the questions. I was actually very willing to share the pastoral logic with all of you, and I think I have a chance now. So this particular community that I mentioned about, the Johias, I'll just begin with like a saying that they have. So before a Johia male passes away on his deathbed, it's very famous that they say something, it's called the Rakhi dialect in Sindhi. So they say, Gau na ghate, dudh na vade, which means the herd should not diminish and the milk should not lessen in any capacity. So those two parameters are not just some cultural prescriptions at all. What I'm trying to say is that there's a lot, many more lessons for sustenance in what the Johiyas are saying here. And in order to elaborate a little more about it, I'd like to give you the context of the field that I'm talking about. So as I said, this was part of my larger PhD thesis. And I was primarily trying to study the nutritional value of millets, because millets is the new nutritional food. We're trying to do away with wheat, we're trying to do away with rice, and we're trying to incorporate millets in our diets. And what I found out was that the consumption of millets, especially in this area of Rajasthan, it cannot happen without the buttermilk or the butter, which are the byproducts when you churn milk. So these are the byproducts that you get. So you get the buttermilk and you get the butter out of which you make the ghee. So that's the traditional way through which they've been practicing nutrition. So these are their local dietetics, and they've been practicing nutrition this way. So, which establishes the point that for the Johiyas and for the communities, the other agrarian communities as well, the necessity to have buttermilk and ghee is primary for their consumption of millets. And bajra, foxtail millet, is something that they all consume in this region. So it's like a yogam, as you say in Ayurveda. These two things, they need to be consumed together. So without one, the other cannot be consumed. So therefore, I call it the logic because the roots of it can be found in Ayurvedic texts like the Charak Samhita and the Ashtanga Rhythm. So there's another, so I use this phrase and I borrow from Mandale's work of Cooking of Life, where he's studying assemblages. And I incorporate this into my paper and I say the Johiyas are also cooking the milk, because the first logic that they give when I talk about mobility and commensality and then being under the sun, they say that the milk actually cooks in the udder of the cow. And the Ashtanga Rhythm, it actually establishes the fact that if the cow moves and if it's under the sun, the milk actually gets cooked. And that's the healthiest milk possibly to have. And it does not need to be pasteurized or boiled in any manner. So what we see here is that what we call as the indigenous body of knowledge in itself derives somewhere like its roots from the Ayurvedic texts. So it's getting established by another body, scientific body of knowledge. But what we tend to do is merely relegate it as cultural prescription or norms or whatsoever. So I hope that clarifies a little about, and then there's more, like if we talk about women, so as you asked, the role of women, I found this really fascinating account where I met this elderly Johiya woman, and she had reserved the milk of the cow she obtained from her black-colored Rakhi cow for her youngest grandson, and he was a premature baby and he wasn't very healthy. And she would always say that the milk from this particular cow is going to go to this one because that's going to help him regain health. And I found the idea really absurd as to why she's classifying cows on the basis of the color. But then again, I found a lot of fascinating stories related to this in Ayurvedic texts where the particular color of the cow also decides the quality of the milk that it produces. So in this particular region, Vata and Pitta, which are like predominant, this kind of milk that you derive from the black-colored cow, when it's cooked in the udder, because it's moving and it's under the sun, it's the healthiest one to consume. So relegating it just simply as so, this conversation that I saw taking place in front of me, there was this Jat man trying to purchase Rakhi cows from a local pastoralist, and he was asking him, show me your healthiest cow, which is the healthiest cow that you have. And he pointed at a cow which was comparatively frail looking, and the guy could not really believe, like he thought he was just trying to sell the cow to him just otherwise. And he said, ye pure hai kya? So he was like, I'm not unsure. He's like, ye Rakhi guy hai, and we've been breeding it. Yeah, so I'll just take 2 more minutes. So we've been breeding it, but mixing ho jata hai, but that does not. He's like, he was vouching for the authenticity or the purity of the milk that that particular cow was producing. So it surely did not alone depend on the A2 classification of the A2 genotype here. And just like coming to your point and trying to sum it up, there's no way that I'm trying to deny that there's no formulary logic to what science has to say about finding the 8-2 genotype. I'm sure there is a lot of validity and legitimacy into what they're trying to say. Not negating that, but I'm saying when you develop products like A2 Bologna, where the key, what you're trying to do is you're trying to defeat the formulary logic of both the knowledge registers, because you're not doing justice to the either. So I hope that clarifies it, and I've answered all the questions here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to respond, but I really don't have much to respond. I really liked your idea of inverting everything and looking at things, and actually I remembered the statement of, the 10th century polymath, Ibn Haytham, when he said that whenever you read something, you have to be enemy of it. And whatever you are thinking about that, you should actually question that as well. So, but having said that, I agree with what you are saying. The heights have been very, very important in determining labor outcomes, overall life quality that are achieved by those people who have better heights. On an average, wherever we see, the empirical evidence, people with better heights tend to earn better wages, and they tend to enjoy more average income. So, this is really, really important, and the cognitive abilities among even within Indian children, when the child is stunted or not. I mean, depending on height, cognitive abilities are quite interrelated. So, these are not just, key fertilizer-induced kind of, heights, and they do matter. And when Indian children grow in better environments, they attain very good heights. For example, those parents who moved out of India and they went to Western Europe or Australia, New Zealand, their children on an average tend to grow as well as the other local standards, and they attain quite well. So, so the idea is that it is not genetically dispossessed. It is actually the environment in which our children are growing, and the whole debate. So Arvind Panagaria's argument in 2013 met a lot of credible opposition. So within that same year, EPW again published about 5-6 articles responding to that. Yeah, responding to that with very credible evidence, and it was kind of almost considered as a deprecated argument, but the government is still pursuing that, and that's why I had to respond to that. Regarding,
Harish, you have really been.
Okay, I'm closing it. No worries.
Yeah, why don't you just quickly, you also just respond, and then we just quickly wind up.
Thank you for your question, ma'am. I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, but you said that it's not really the people themselves, but the society is also disabled. I would actually agree with that statement, because just think about it. I'm not sure if, as a society, we really understand the category of disability and completely. And as this was evident recently when the case of a trainee IAS officer who had allegedly used a disabled certificate and entered, how there was almost like a war that broke out on social media about scanning the accounts of other people who had entered the services with disability, and it was said that, oh, see, they don't look disabled, how can they be disabled? And that is actually really defeating the entire idea of the fact that there could be multiple ways in which disabilities manifest, do not manifest, lived, and there's a whole regime of, there's a whole range of ways in which disabilities make themselves evident and not evident. So I think to say that there is one way of being disabled is correct. that was what I actually took from that episode of disability being out there in public debate, which is very rare actually. We usually either relegate them to Divyang, divine-bodied, or handicapped, and also that would be my response. But we could talk more about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Vinay has kindly decided to forego her remarks in the discussion, so we can all go and have tea. Okay. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Tata.
I'm so sorry for this.